U.S. Special Forces will have their hands full when they arrive in Iraq to assist in the fight against ISIS. The terror group has carved out a large section of Iraq and Syria in its mission to create an Islamic state. The leaders of ISIS have grown their empire so quickly that the world has struggled to respond. So how did ISIS do this? For that, we turn to Joby Warrick, a Washington Post national security reporter and author of Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS. Thanks so much for being with us. Your book profiles Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, known as the founding father of what would become ISIS. When Zarqawi was killed by a U.S. airstrike in 2006, the group's new leader became al-Baghdadi. Why was he chosen as the replacement?
Well, it was almost accidentally. There was a bit of an interlude there where there were a couple other leaders who were, heading the organization, and then they got killed. So he ends up being kind of the leader by default after others around him were taken out. It was a real active period in 2006 and 2008, which is a little bit actually relevant to what we're looking at right now, in which special forces really got ISIS's number, or al-Qaeda in Iraq's number, and would chase them down, killed senior leaders, and really put them on their heels. And out of that turmoil, this fairly unknown, not very experienced leader comes up named Baghdadi, and he turns out to be a pretty horrible guy in his own right, and just as violent, just as crude as his predecessors.
What do we know about Baghdadi's childhood and his, his formative years leading up to his rise to power?
Well, describe him in the book as a bit of a religious nerd as a kid. He was a kid that went to the mosque and spent a lot of time talking to imams. His career path was actually to be a professor. He was going to be like a teacher of theology. Then the Iraq invasion takes place in 2003, and as a good Muslim, a conservative Muslim, he felt it was his duty to fight the invaders. And so he got involved in these insurgent movements and then ends up becoming radicalized through that process.
Tell us about him getting picked up in a U.S. sweep. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, he became an inmate at the American-run prison camp, Camp Bucca in southern Iraq. Tell us about his time there, because some people have implied that if Baghdadi was not at Bucca, that there might not have been an ISIS. Is that an overstatement, you think?
Well, there's a bunch of, if this had happened or this had happened, we wouldn't have had an ISIS today, going back 15 years. But what you have in common here is a bunch of guys who were pretty radical as it was, but they become more radicalized, more driven to violent action by their time in prison. And Baghdadi was one of a generation of guys running ISIS now that were captured by U.S. forces, put in this big kind of warehouse, which became kind of a jihadi university in a way, because they were all corralled together. They ended up kind of feeding on each other and radicalizing each other. So out of that process emerges someone who had started out being, radical, but then came out very dangerous.
The Pentagon, as you mentioned, has announced it's sending special ops forces to Syria and Iraq. In an interview yesterday, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, reacted to the effort to rally a broader coalition against ISIS. Here's part of his response.
If they wanted to learn from what happened in Paris recently, why didn't they learn from Charlie Hebdo? The same principle, the same concept, and with the tip of the iceberg. What's under the water is much bigger. They didn't learn.
All right, so given what we know about the rise of ISIS, how do you crack down on extremism without creating more of it?
Well, it's interesting and a little bit cynical what Assad is doing here, because all along he's tried to make the case that it's not about me, it's about these radicals that are coming into my country and killing people. And in a sense, he helped create that situation, because he's the one that created this horrible civil war that we see now. We refuse to budge, refuse to make concessions to really legitimate democratic demands, and into this security vacuum comes ISIS. And he continues to make this argument that support me and you'll be able to get rid of these terrorists. What we do need, I think, eventually is a way to figure out, a solution for some kind of government in Syria that can unite the country. That's a tall order, but eventually you're going to have to get some kind of control over the areas that ISIS now controls if you want to come up with a solution.
Joby, when you look at the landscape here for ISIS and the land that they control, the populations, there are stories about how they've essentially inserted themselves into positions of what were once government positions to provide, services and goods to people. Was there a point at which the United States, you think, absolutely underestimated how ISIS was going to reach this sort of pinnacle of power, that all that territory that they now enjoy?
Yeah, that's been part of the ISIS stories. We've underestimated them again and again. Nobody really thought that this ragtag band of terrorists was going to be able to march into Iraq and take over major cities, the second largest city in Iraq. But they've been able to do it, and they're pretty good at holding territory once they get in it. And the challenge now is, regardless of what kinds of airstrikes we do, and even with special forces on the ground, to drive them out of these strongholds is going to be a really big challenge, and it's going to keep us occupied, I think, for months and months to come.
And Joby, the allure here, I mean, social media is something that you have to talk about when you talk about the reach of ISIS, because obviously in this day and age, we talk about not just ISIS in those places in Iraq and Syria, but extending to ISIS sympathizers around the world. What's behind that allure?
Yeah, and it really goes back to the earliest days, because way back in 2004, Zarqawi, this godfather of ISIS, pioneered this idea of sort of intimate terrorism. It's not sort of the explosion, it's not the bombing that really frightens people. It's taking a single individual and killing him on camera. And he did that in 2004 with an American, Nick Berg, put him in an orange jumpsuit and cut his head off personally with his own hand, and then just distributed the image on the internet. And these guys are good at taking these horrific images, which frighten and horrify most of us, but really excite his base and drive recruits and donors to his side.
All right, fascinating insight there. Joby Warrick, thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.